In last week's episode, we talked about the pros and cons of trigger warnings in college classrooms. Let's see what you had to say. First things first, a small bit of not comment-related news. Idea Channel finally has a t-shirt, this t-shirt, if you can see. Thank you, Morgan. We have like a t-shirt design that you can buy. You can buy Idea Channel t-shirts. Not this t-shirt, your own. Cool. It was designed by my friend Andrea, who is an awesome and talented illustrator. We'll put links to her work and the dftba.com store where you can purchase this in the doobly-doo. We have a couple other things on the way right now. This is the one thing that we have. Again, not just this single one, this single design. I gotta get off this boat. If you would like your very own Idea Channel t-shirt, you can find a link to the dftba.com store in the doobly-doo. Get them while supplies last. Pretty sure we can print basically an infinite number of these, so get them because you like us and enjoy the t-shirt. This has been me asking you to buy our shirt. Hey, okay, first bit of actual comment-related news. Thank you to everyone who had such a great and reasoned and reasonable and respectful conversation on both the subreddit and on YouTube for this video last week. There was a fair amount of tension, I think, and there, things get heated and people get upset and say things that aren't the nicest, but I think that the level of conversation we reached surrounding this topic was altogether actually really, really good, especially on the subreddit. The conversation that happened around this video on the subreddit was so good. So I just want to say, not that you need my approval or anything, but man, I just want to say thank you, and it was great to witness and be involved in. So I just want to put that right up front after asking you to buy our t-shirt. Rathdrgnknight raised a really great point that a lot of other people sort of touched on, which is this worry that it seems like a good number of the people who are requesting trigger warnings or who are upset when they are not present are not in fact people who suffer from anxiety or PTSD or depression, etc. And I think that there are a couple different ways to look at this. The first is that I don't think you necessarily need to be someone who suffers from anxiety or PTSD in order to advocate for those people who do. I don't think that you need to be a sufferer of any illness or disease or sickness in order to advocate for people who do experience that thing. And that, it's nice when there is a support network around people who, suffer in the way that some people might. But second, I think there's also a necessary amount of nuance that is lacking in certain parts of this conversation. And the nature of that nuance is a strong understanding of what kinds of things tend to cause problems for people who have anxiety or PTSD, as opposed to that fictional construct of millennials that I talked about in the episode of someone who's just offended at everything. Because that person, I think that person really is a caricature. And I think that having a conversation about the kinds of things that we should reasonably expect people might be upset with will clear the air a lot of this kind of PC boogeyman of you can't say anything. Because I think when you talk with people who actually suffer from these things, they're not going to say to you that you can't talk. It's just being cognizant of the very particular situations and subjects where trouble is caused. And I think that those things are fair and easy to avoid. Matthew Hartman, Boss 1000, and a couple other people pointed out that they might actually not have any problem with the idea of trigger warnings as long as they are called content warnings, that the actual title of trigger warning is itself something that has taken on lots and lots of extra meaning. And there was a really great conversation about this in the subreddit as well, which I would encourage you to check out. I could really go either way on this, but I think it's an interesting response to the whole thing. Avery makes a really, really great comment of this idea that I wish that I had gotten to in the episode, which is a difference, an important distinction between moral and psychological discomfort. That we can expect college to put people in situations where they experience all kinds of moral discomfort, that we're looking at things in the world and they are affecting the way that we think the world works, that we think the world should be, but that is not necessarily exactly the same as psychological discomfort, which is a thing that can and should be avoided for the sake of interacting with and interrogating moral discomfort. C.B. Droege, a literature professor, also wrote an amazing comment that I would not only encourage but almost insist that you read. This is especially great because it touches on something that we only had time to discuss very, very briefly in the episode, which is how colleges are responding to this situation, and that their response is sort of influencing the conversation in a way that tends to be unhelpful for almost everybody, and C.B. Droege goes into great detail on this, talks about how it's not necessarily a problem with the students, but it is a problem with colleges as institutions and how they treat both the student body and their instructors. So yeah, great comment. Thank you for writing it. Highly recommended. William May has a really interesting point of view as far as trigger warnings are concerned, sort of likens them to spoiler alerts that, if you are letting your students know ahead of time that there's difficult stuff in, say, the books that they're reading, then you are in some way ruining their natural response to that stuff. And that natural response is necessary for interacting with novels, with literature in the way that college students would. And I don't necessarily know that I agree with this. I can totally see this point of view, but I think that what it does is it turns the way that you interact with media or culture in college into entertainment, which I don't think it is, and I don't think it's supposed to be. That, we want our entertainment to be unspoiled so that when it happens, we have that natural response. But what you do in college is not entertainment. It's, critical inquiry. It is sort of intellectual consideration. And so from that perspective, I would say that it is almost better not just to provide trigger warnings, but to talk with the class up front about everything that happens in a work so that they can see as closely as possible how all of the sort of contingent parts that create the complex of the work that they're looking at add up and function throughout the course of the story. And that trigger warnings as a spoiler, sort of indicates that we're here to be entertained, not here to, sort of look at something as closely as possible. I don't know. That's my perspective, I guess. I can't help but think about 9th grade in my English class, where the teacher, before we would watch a movie, she would write out on the whiteboard every single thing that would happen in the movie. She would write down all of the plot points. She would write about we would talk about the way that the cinematography was going to change, the way that the editing would change. And I remember thinking as a kid that she was ruining movie day, because I just wanted to watch a movie like a ninth grader does. You just want to watch the movie, you want to not think, you want it to not be class. And what she was doing is she was turning watching the movie into work. And it worked. It absolutely worked, because there was no way for me to sit there and not interact with the thing that I was watching, given the framework that she had built the day before. And that I was forced to look at all of these different parts moving and changing and having a relationship to one another, as opposed to just having them sort of gloss over in front of my eyes. And for a couple of movies that we watched, she did absolutely. She was like, and just so you know, like, there's going to be some naked people, and you're just going to have to deal with that. And I expect all of you to be, to be adults about it. So, she didn't call it a trigger warning, but it was essentially a content warning. I think it was so effective. I just thought it was very effective. I don't know. Tarvis on the subreddit asks a really good question about safe spaces, which is a thing that we didn't talk about in this video at all. And actually something that I don't have a lot of expertise in. I have almost no experience with them, and actually didn't know a whole lot about them before the middle of last week. And from what I understand, it seems like the problem that is perceived with safe spaces is roughly the same as the problem that is perceived with trigger warnings, that it's people attempting to avoid interacting with ideas that they find offensive or difficult or counter to their held beliefs. At its base level, I don't necessarily see a problem with this, that if someone needs a place to go to work through their own beliefs or talk to other people who also share those beliefs without having to just constantly defend them from counter arguments, sure, I feel like we all need that in some form or another pretty frequently. The fear, of course, seems to be, much like the fear with trigger warnings, that people use safe spaces to completely and totally avoid any kind of opinion or idea or content or information that acts counter to their beliefs. And again, like trigger warnings, I would be surprised if the use of a safe space equates completely and totally and 100% isomorphically with the like total avoidance of all things that you disagree with. It doesn't seem that way, but again, like I said, I don't know much about safe spaces, so I would be curious to know from you what you have to say about this whole question as it relates to the things that we talked about in last week's video. neeneko writes a really great comment about how the apples of the trigger warning discussion is really this idea that there are a certain class or group of people who are allowed to be offended by things because it has sort of been determined by the majority that the things that they find offensive are normal or okay to be offended by, and that when there is another group of people, generally a smaller group of people, who are offended by different things, and particularly if they are offended by things that that first large group do or say, that it turns into a conversation about what's okay or right to be offended by. And I think that this is a really, really insightful comment. Lots of really good ideas packed into a small amount of text, and is something that I am going to be thinking about a lot. So thank you for this comment and for sort of planting this in my brain. This is, I think, a very interesting and big idea.